Welcome, everybody. This is, I think this is the biggest webinar event that the Canadian Psychedelic Association has done by far. We needed to upgrade our Zoom account from the 500-person account to the 1,000-person account. So there's at least 1,000 of you there, and thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Trevor Millar. I'm with the Canadian Psychedelic Association, one of the founding board members. And it's a real honor and treat to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Gabor Maté, onto the webinar today to speak about healing trauma with psychedelics. So I guess the intro I thought I would give Gabor is a little bit more heartfelt than just reading his bio, but Gabor has, he's a vibrant member of the psychedelic community, as it were. I met Gabor um, through this community. Actually, we met first around my work with Ibogaine, and I was introduced to him outside an event he was speaking at. He kind of lent his support behind us right away and said, "Let me know anything I can do to help." And and I reached out to him shortly thereafter and said, well, we actually need a physician that might be able to help us. And he worked with us to help find a physician. We had a nurse working with us, and it's just been a really great relationship. And what I think Gabor really does is gives of himself so much to the local psychedelic community and beyond, and has really brought a lot of mainstream attention to this cause. So thank you so much for being here, Gabor. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm well. As you know, I'm working on my new book, and so I'm in a good phase with it. So that's good, as opposed to being panicked and stressed out as I was about a year ago now. And I'm taking good care of myself, so I'm well. Thank you, and it's good to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And I guess there's a bit of housekeeping to do that I thought I would bring up here first. And this is almost the webinar that didn't happen. And I just wanted to kind of just share a bit of an apology to, I realize there's a bunch of different people who are potentially watching this. There are people who are very familiar with Gabor's work, probably know Gabor quite well, and are members of the so-called psychedelic community and know him through that. There are people who know Gabor's work, but don't necessarily know about the tie to psychedelics. And then there's probably people that know Gabor's work and know the tie to psychedelics as well. So I just wanted to address that smaller local community first. And I guess, I try to be all about light and unity and healing and health and the betterment of community overall. And in the past, I think it's fair to say that I was largely a Facebook addict for quite some time. And through that phase, which I was largely unemployed for about 3 years, there were days where I was sitting on Facebook for 18 hours a day or more, posting 20 times a day or more. And throughout the course of that, there were times that I kind of slipped onto the battlefield and stood for less than those values that I mentioned before of wholeness and unity. And I just wanted to say I'm sorry. There were definitely people who were offended through the course of that. A lot of it was there was potentially some mindless posts, some boneheaded posts, as Gabor called them the other day when we were speaking about it. So I just wanted to say I'm really, really sorry about that. And maybe I'll just allow Gabor to speak on the topic. And then there was something else that we wanted to bring into play around this as well.
Well, so the fact is that quite apart from your particular boneheaded posts, as we can call them, and other issues, there's a broader issue in the psychedelic community that as psychedelics have gained popularity, a lot of people have engaged in psychedelic sessions and informal research. There's always an ethical side to it, and like in all fields of endeavor, spiritual or secular, there are transgressions and boundary violations, and that has already happened in the psychedelic world more than a little bit, both in traditional realms such as ayahuasca shamans who sexually exploited their clients. We know of such people,
Mhm.
both in terms of credentials, therapists. Here in British Columbia, there's a case that under the aegis of MAPS, a person, not with the knowledge of MAPS, but under the aegis of MAPS research, a person was sexually exploited by their therapist. And I think all of us who work in the psychedelic field have made mistakes. And so recently there's been a lot of fair bit of activity critiquing you, Trevor, as you know. Some of the criticisms I happen to know are just not inaccurate because I happen to know the facts. Others, I think, are probably more accurate, and you've probably done things in the psychedelic realm that were not skillful and maybe even hurtful to some people. I certainly, if somebody critiqued me very closely, if they but knew, I've made my own mistakes in providing psychedelic therapy. I think we have to acknowledge that. And I think we have to, and then there's posts that you made that to me were appalling, in terms of lack of sensitivity and awareness. Having said that, here we are, and it's a matter of owning our mistakes and of creating structures and an atmosphere where people are safe to feel safe to come forward and make their complaints and their concerns known. So we'll talk more about that, how to create that. But let's just acknowledge that there was some issue as to whether this podcast will go out or not, given certain issues that were raised about your work, which have not convinced me that you're not a good person. They have not convinced me because people have not presented evidence. And furthermore, they've said things that I know not to be true. There's also some criticisms that are legitimate, not enough in any way to stop me from working with you. So here we are. That's the elephant in the room that we had to acknowledge before we go out with our formal talk, which I'm now ready to do. And I think the lesson is for all of us that, first of all, we all make mistakes. None of us are above um, stumbling in this path. And we have to be very open and very transparent. And we have to create structures in the psychedelic world where people can come forward and make their concerns and specific grievances, if there's any such, known. So that initiative is now going forward. We'll talk about it later. That, I think, is what we had to clear out of the way before we could engage in our conversation.
Thank you for that. And I was thinking, this is called Healing Trauma with Psychedelics. And I was thinking that maybe at the end of this chat, which I expect to go for about 30 minutes from now, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if people have questions, they can populate the question and answer box there. But I know that your new book is called The Myth of Normal. And I think when we're speaking about the context of healing trauma with psychedelics, I think there's a very important point that is outlined in even just the title of your book, The Myth of Normal, that really indicates that there is a lot of trauma that all of us have that could potentially be solved by psychedelics. So could you maybe speak a little bit about your book, what the myth of normal means, and then maybe tie that into your broad view of what trauma is and how trauma holds us back as individuals and society?
Sure. So I don't want to say too much about the book because it won't come out for another year, next April. But the title is The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. And what I mean by an insane culture is Eric Fromm was a social psychologist, wrote a book called The Sane Society in 1955, in which he pointed out that there's a far greater incidence of emotional distress and mental health issues the more advanced countries become industrially and economically, the more that they generate mental illness. And that's accelerated. We know the burgeoning rates of trauma, post traumatic stress disorder, substance use, addictions, depression, anxiety, suicides, children being diagnosed with all manner of conditions left, right, and center. Well, there's got to be something driving that. And the what Fromm said in 55 is that mental health can't be defined in terms of an individual fitting into society, but in terms of how a society meets human needs for optimal development and health. And that's what I mean by an insane culture. This society does not meet human needs. So when you look at what human needs are for interconnectedness, for belonging, for meaning, for purpose, for genuine self-esteem, uh, as opposed to based on the valuation of others. When you look at what children's needs are for unconditional acceptance, holding by parents in a way that modern society doesn't hold kids, um, free play in nature, um, whether right from birth and even before through life, this society is not one that meets, but actually denies genuine human needs. As a result, and a need is something that, when withheld, will lead to negative results. So, given that no possible strictly biological explanation can account for the burgeoning rates of mental distress in this culture, pre-COVID, I'm even talking about. Genetics don't explain it. First of all, genetics have very little to do with mental illness, regardless of what the propaganda says, number one. Number two, genes don't change over a couple of decades or 3 or 4 or 5 decades. So it's got to be the environment. And the features of the environment that promote distress are the fact that, number one, a lot of people are traumatized in childhood. Number two, almost everybody lives in a setting where their actual needs for healthy and optimal development are denied. Hence, you're going to get a lot of distress. Now, where do psychedelics come in? Well, first of all, I got to say, I'm not a psychedelic evangelist. I don't think psychedelics are going to save the world. I think that's a much broader issue. And at the best of times, to be realistic about it, psychedelics will be available only for a small minority of people. Why is that? Number one, right now, just the whole legal situation, which is not going to change overnight. It's so difficult even to get approval just for research studies, let alone for broad use. Number one. Number two, it's not psychedelics as such that promote the healing, but the context in which those psychedelics are administered and experienced. And that takes a lot of trained, very grounded, very developed people. Where are those people? And then there's the expense. Like if you look at something like the current studies on MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder, which are very promising and which consciousness of which is really reaching the mainstream. There was a big article in the New York Times just last weekend about it. But that's 2 therapists with 1 client over 6 hours over 4 sessions. Very expensive. So that's, first of all, the practicability of it is one reason why I'm not a psychedelic evangelist. Number one. Number two, the issues are so deeply grounded in society and the culture that only social and cultural transformation will really deal with those issues for a lot of people. Having said that, I'm on the advisory board of a clinic in Vancouver called Numinous and a company, and there are more and more initiatives. There's the Sentinel and the Kootenays, and there's Dimensions, which is a company starting up back east. A lot of initiatives around psychedelic work. So on the one hand, I support it. I just don't want to put all our eggs into that basket. Having said that, how do they work, and why can they be helpful? To put this very simply, throughout the course of development, when we're traumatized, we build up all these defenses. And trauma is a wound that we sustain during the course of development. But when there's a wound, we develop defenses against feeling the pain of it. And we develop scar tissue to cover up the wound. And the scar tissue is hard and it doesn't grow and it's not elastic and it hasn't got no feeling in it. It's got no nerve endings. And so there's 2 aspects to trauma, which comes from a Greek word for wounding or for wound. One is you get this sensitive spot where if you're touched, it really hurts. On the one hand, on the other hand, you have scar tissue that doesn't grow, that is inflexible, that doesn't feel. And both the part that really hurts and the part that doesn't feel and is inflexible, that's what we call the personality. So the human personality really develops around these core wounds and our defenses against those wounds. Now, psychedelics, the personality for a period of a few hours disappears. Not totally, but it loosens its grip on your mind. And now you can experience the pain you've been running away from, but you can experience it not no longer as a vulnerable child, but as an adult who can hold the pain with the adequate support. This is where the support comes in. So you can experience the pain that you sustained and you've been holding and hiding from all your life. And you can also experience that innocent, genuine self that was covered over by all that scar tissue. So that's what a good psychedelic session, and I don't care what substance you're talking about, can provide. And it's a powerful way to learn about what you've been carrying on your life. And from that point of view, people sometimes talk about bad trips. And from my perspective, as somebody who's led psychedelic sessions, both in a group setting, also more personally, there's no such thing as a bad trip or a bad experience. What there is painful experience that is might be frightening, experience that bring up all kinds of emotions you never wanted to experience because you already did once and it was so painful then. But that doesn't make it bad. If the context is right, you can learn from those experiences, those difficult um, emotions, and you can learn how to hold them and you can grow from them. So whether somebody has a beautiful, transcendent, open-hearted, love-filled, joyful journey, good for them. That's great. Wait for the next one. My experience, or whether somebody has an experience that really is difficult and frightening for them, in the right context with the right guidance, there's transformation. And so this is how psychedelics can help, is by relaxing the hold of our defenses and our conditioned personalities so that what is deeper and truer about us, whether it's pain or pleasure, can emerge. So that's where the power of psychedelics comes in.
Beautiful. Thank you. Could we maybe just take a few steps back and I first heard about, I think probably you in general and your work with psychedelics through a documentary that was on the CBC called The Jungle Prescription on David Suzuki's Nature of Things. And I think it came out in 2011 actually. So no, I would have known you before then, but I just couldn't believe the the courage that you had. Like we've come a long way since it airing in 2011, which means this probably would have been filmed around 2010, 2009. And you were a licensed physician at the time who took residents of Vancouver's downtown east side and worked with them with ayahuasca. That just seems like, quite frankly, one of the most ballsy things I've ever done or ever seen. And I could see that I think you did take some heat for that. So could you maybe just take a step back and maybe introduce how you first heard about psychedelics? And then I'm fascinated as to how the nature of things heard about you and convinced you into doing something like that.
Yes, well, of course, being a child I shouldn't say child of the 60s, but a young person in the 60s, psychedelics were around. And they were around not necessarily in a good way, because people were using them in a very undisciplined, random fashion. So I had my experiences specifically with LSD. back then, and then I had nothing to do with them for many decades. And then when my book on addiction came out, like I worked at the last 12 years of my medical trajectory were spent in the downtown city of Vancouver, working with a highly traumatized and highly addicted population. And then I wrote this book on addiction called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which immediately became a national bestseller and opened a lot of conversation around trauma and addiction. It almost seems absurd now that I had to argue then that addictions are rooted in trauma. It's like the research is so overwhelming, but even now it's still a debate. Well, it's not a debate because there's no legitimate argument against it. It's only that a lot of people are not aware of it yet, I think particularly people in the treatment professions. Anyway, I wrote that book in which I talked about my experience in the downtown east side and explained the brain biology of addiction and how the biology of addiction is rooted in childhood trauma, so on and so forth. And then I was on book tour and had a lot of invitations to speak, and off and on, and more on than off, somebody would raise their hands and say, "Well, Dr. Maté or Gabor, what do you know about ayahuasca and the treatment of addiction?" And I'd say, "Well, I know nothing about it." Thank you. I go on to my next speaking engagement. Nothing. What do you know about freedom of addiction? Nothing. Thank you very much. And finally, I got sick of the question because, like, for God's sakes, I just spent 3 years of my life pouring heart and soul and mind into creating this book, and you keep asking me about the one thing I don't know anything about, you know? And then somebody came to me and said, "Did you know you could experience it here in Vancouver?" And then I realized the universe is knocking on my door. It wasn't accidental that people kept asking me. So then there was a shaman from Peru that came up to Vancouver, led some psychedelic sessions. I participated, and I understood right away why people were asking me the questions because I experienced both the pain that I'd been running from and the deep love that I had lost contact with as a result of my own trauma, and I got it. And then I thought, well, this is nice, but it's not quite it because in the Amazon, in its original context, ayahuasca ceremonies were not held for a bunch of strangers who came together for one night and then split in the morning. It was a communal event, and people knew each other, and the shaman knew everybody, and so on. So I thought, well, how can we create that? And I met some really fine ayahuasca providers trained by shamans, and we began to work together developing retreats. And the whole idea of a retreat was that people would come together for not just for one night, but for a whole week. And let's have 3 ceremonies in a week, and we get to know each other during the day. Let's talk about our issues. Let's explore our traumas, what our intentions are for the ceremony. Next day, let's share our experience, see what we can learn from it. And so I began to help lead these retreats. And then some documentary filmmakers back east called me and they said, "Well, we know your work around addiction, but we're looking for a physician who knows something about addiction and maybe some experience working with ayahuasca." I said, "Are you kidding me?" And so it wasn't the nature of things. It was these documentary filmmakers who then made the film that appeared on the nature of things. So that's how that happened. And that, I think, was in, like you say, 2011 or so.
Yeah, it's uh it's an amazing documentary. And then, uh, is it correct that the night after it aired, you got a call from Health Canada?
No, that's not quite it. So then what happened was we were invited to, by the way, I also, to be honest, you see the documentary, a lot of truth in it, but it was also doctored, and I don't mean that by me.
Hmm.
The endings weren't as happy as the film makes it out to be. Not the long term.
Hmm.
I wish it was otherwise, but fact is, it's impossible to get people to transform in a space of 2 ceremonies after a life of trauma and ostracization and poverty. So
Hmm.
We showed what was possible. The results were really promising, but not as positive as the film seemed to indicate. Having said that, we were then asked by a First Nations community here in British Columbia to come and do this program with them. We did, and that was studied by a group from the University of Victoria. Health Canada found out about it, and they sent me a letter saying, you can't do these studies without our permission, so on, and that is what the insanity of things are, folks. Ayahuasca then, by then, was legal in Canada for religious purposes. Health Canada acknowledged that it was neither harmful nor addictive. So if you had a religious exemption, like the Santo Daime Church, you could actually import the stuff and use it in ceremony, but not for therapeutic purposes, even though it's not addictive nor harmful. This is where the tyranny of bureaucracy and the irrationality of policy comes into it. Mm-hmm. So I got this letter saying, if you keep doing research against rules. I wasn't doing research. I was just doing what I was doing. I said, okay, thank you very much. And that was the end of that. It didn't stop me from continuing to work with the plant. And of course, since then, there's been a lot more research, not just into that, but all kinds of other psychedelics. So I didn't get into any serious trouble. I just got a letter, which I had to acknowledge.
Nice.
That was it. But people still have to look for permission, even though we know from international studies, which have been done, and from vast experience, that particular plant isn't harmful or addictive. So why do we have to keep fighting tooth and nail for something so obvious when I've personally seen, and in other studies, it has been documented, how people heal from depressions and addictions, and I've seen people get much better from physical illnesses for all kinds of reasons through the use of ayahuasca. Some really miracle stories. It's also no panacea. So again, I'm not evangelizing. I'm saying that something is possible here. Why not give it full latitude?
Mm-hmm. So without evangelizing, you did mention that you've seen some pretty incredible transformations. Are there any transformations that stand out maybe a bit more than the others on kind of the miracles that seem to be fulfilled as well with these substances?
Now, if you properly understand the mind-body unity and how our physiology is connected with our psychology and how our emotions affect the body and vice versa, then these are not miracles. Mm-hmm. When people get to know themselves and experience them deeply and work through their traumas, of course their physiology will respond positively in many cases. So from the strict scientific point of view, it's no miracle at all. Not that, again, it's the problem is that this society, and specifically the medical training that physicians receive, separates the mind from the body. And from that point of view, how is this even possible? Knowing the unity, having written about it, and having worked with it for decades, it's no miracle. When people transform their relationship to themselves, that is when they heal their trauma, of course their body can respond. So I've seen people heal from severe autoimmune disease, even end of life, or I should say so-called terminal autoimmune disease. I've seen some people overcome malignancy. I've seen people heal from severe depression, suicidality, severe addictions, and so on. That nothing in Western medicine could possibly do. Now, this is not to denigrate Western medicine, which has got its own great achievements and contributions and miracles, if you like. It's just that there's this other modality that can be very effective, that we have to fight so hard to get accepted and to get even to be considered. Fortunately, that movement is very well established now. And as I said in the beginning, a lot of initiatives around it, including the very existence of this society who's sponsoring this particular podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know you did some work you would go down with a shaman to Mexico and bring people for retreats in Mexico. Could you maybe paint a picture of what, within this obviously broken society, what kind of preparation can a person do to make this great for themselves? When you were in Mexico with people, what did you do that might be different from kind of your run of the mill, go for ayahuasca for a weekend and come home on Monday kind of thing? And then what kind of integration would you suggest people do afterwards? What, in this broken world, how could you best prepare people to go into an experience like this so they see the transformation thereafter?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that people really do need to find the right people to work with. That's the most important thing. And it's hard to give guidelines on that. But just who you work with, who provides the medicine, and how well trained they are, and how much integrity they have, and how grounded they are. That's absolutely crucial. Um, Specifically for ayahuasca, but also from some of the other substances, there's a kind of dieta or dietary rules that you have to follow. They're not onerous, but no red meat and no dairy products, probably no fermented products, no caffeine, they say, and all that. Emotionally, you have to prepare yourself by really thinking, well, why do I want to do this? Like, what is it in me that needs transformation? What am I looking for? What healing am I seeking? So that involves a deep engagement with the self. And when people came to our retreats, they didn't just go into ceremony. We spent the first day and a half just getting to know people in the circle. People would talk about what brought them there. My job is a kind of a laser like capacity to do that. You've seen me do it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get down why you're really here. I know why you think you're here, but why you're really, you know. And
Your compassionate inquiry.
uh, when I'm good at it, it's compassionate. Not, I haven't always been that way, by the way. I could be very aggressive,
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that was the intent. And also, all that time we're building community. So people are sharing their vulnerability in a way with a group of total strangers that they've never shared before, even or especially with their own family members or even friends. So there's that getting to know one another, identifying the deeper issues, and community formation and trust building, and then helping people formulate an intention for the ceremony, and then the ceremony itself, during which I'm just a silent participant, and the shamans take over. And then the next day, after people have slept and after they've eaten, then we process their experience, whether they experienced it as distressing or delightful, it doesn't matter. We just went through, well, what's the meaning here? What was your inner self really trying to tell you? Because the plants or the substances, they don't put anything in you. They just open up whatever is there. Well, that's huge. So then we would say, well, what opened up? And in a similar fashion, then we prepared for the 3 ceremonies that we had during the week. A lot of sharing, a lot of communality, a lot of coming together, a lot of opening up. And that's how it went. And then afterwards, the integration, that's always the most difficult because people come together, then they go to different places and they go back into this crazy world that doesn't even know how to understand their experiences, let alone to honor them or to support them. So then how do people maintain contact with one another and so we eventually developed a system of integration and people staying in touch and people having other people available to them to support the integration. So I think preparation, intention, communality, um, and then afterwards ongoing integration, because It's one thing to have a wonderful, deep, insightful, and what feels like transformative experience. But if you're like me, and like many people, you can have those experiences and then go back and a week later like it never happened because it needs integration. And because what you experienced in a certain altered state of mind might be the truth, but your usual state of mind resists it and doesn't even know it. So integration is everything.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a bunch of good questions that are up here, I see, but I think first of all, we mentioned at the top that we were moving towards something called the Canadian Psychedelic Association Reconciliation Council. And this is something that's been underway for quite some time. I wasn't even aware of it. There's lots of people at the CPA doing great work. We got an email yesterday from Gillian Maxwell and Dr. Pam Crisco about the obvious need as different things like open letters are coming forth. There's an obvious gap within the current psychedelic community where people need a venue in order to air their concerns, where there's the potential for kind of healing. I don't know, I think you have a copy of that email as well. Did you want to touch upon a few of those things?
Well, I don't go into in great detail, but except to say that there is this initiative, and there's got to be a place. Like, let's say, if I should conduct a psychedelic session, and you come out of it upset, either because I wasn't present with you, or you perceived that I wasn't, or God forbid I crossed some boundary, or whatever. There's got to be a place where you can go, where you can say, "This happened with Gabor, and I want this dealt with." Now, ideally, if that person feels safe enough, they'll come to me and say, "Listen, I'm not happy with what happened," then we can resolve it. But if we can't, there's got to be a place where somebody can go, where they know it's going to be neutral in the sense that the people looking at this material are not there to protect me as a provider, or for that matter, to prosecute me either, but just to look at the facts and to come to some decisions. So Jillian and Pam wrote this email. They're starting this initiative. It's not the only such initiative. There are other such initiatives, but the more bodies there are, the more where somebody can, in confidence, take their concerns and issues, the safer this practice will be.
Mm-hmm.
And once they've done their due diligence, then they ought to be able to state so publicly that we looked at Gabor's work and it's just not up to scratch, or he committed an ethical lapse or something, and that's got to be made public. So that's just essential, especially since when people are working with psychedelics, they're so vulnerable, they're so open, they're so influenceable that there has to be this protection.
Yeah, I'm happy to see that the CPA is setting something like that up. As we've discussed, I've I've sat with about close to 300 people, I would say, on through experiences, and most of those have gone great. But there have been times where I was distracted, where the trust wasn't built before the session started. There was one incident in particular that thankfully it did get back to almost a council through my relationship to MAPS Canada, and Mark Hayden approached me. He heard that something had happened, and we went through a huge healing process. And that gentleman and I that I had been working with, at the end, we really hugged it out. And he said to me, look, I'm actually really glad it happened this way because we've both learned so much. And I had to agree with him. So if we can set up formal processes where the potential for that healing to take place, then that's really what this community, I think, is all about, is how do we continue with the unity that these medicines so often engender in us. So happy to announce that CPA Reconciliation Council on a webinar like this with you, Gabor. So thanks so much. So let's dive into this first question I see from Dana, I believe. Hi, Gabor. Do you have newer observations on healing ADHD and or addictions with psychedelics and plant medicines? I have found microdosing with LSD helpful in certain contexts, and there is ongoing research in Switzerland about the subject. So maybe two questions about their ADHD, addiction, the effectiveness there, and then a question on microdosing as well.
Yeah. So I don't have much to say about microdosing because, as far as I can see, there's no good studies yet that prove the value of microdosing. Lots of people say it's really helped them. I'm not against it. It's not likely to do any harm if you're doing it according to protocol. That, say, Paul Stamets' protocol for mushrooms or somebody else's protocol for this, that, and the other. As long as you follow those protocols, you're not going to get into trouble. Whether they're in the long term harmful or not, I think that remains to be seen. I've tried it here and there. I can't say I have some good days with it. I've had some good days with it, but I can't say really that it's been transformative for me. Again, my experience is not necessarily determinative of what other people's experience were. I just can't say, I can't speak to it with any expertise or documented evidence. ADHD and addiction. By the way, they're closely linked because people with ADHD are much more prone for addiction. And if you don't know why, read my books on ADHD and addiction. But they're both rooted in childhood stress. And I remember it was a shaman said to me at 1 a.m. during an ayahuasca ceremony, there was a person with severe ADHD in the tent in the Malacca. And the shaman said to me, "Hey, Gabor, I just got what ADHD is all about." And I said, "Yeah, what is it?" He said, "An immense fear of the present moment."
Wow.
And then the shaman got this. Well, of course, that's what it is, because why do people tune out? Because the moment is too stressful for them. So ADHD is not this disease that you inherit. It's not a biological disorder of the brain as such. The biology of the brain itself is shaped by life experience. So when children experience a lot of stress, one way to deal with it is to tune out, which then gets programmed into the brain. Now they got this so-called disease. It's not a disease. And addiction is always rooted in trauma and pain as well. And both ADHD and addictions involve the brain's dopamine pathways. In fact, how we treat ADHD is to give medications like Ritalin or Dexedrine, Adderall, to elevate dopamine levels. And addictions all have to do with dopamine. So of course the two correlate, you know. What I want to say to people is don't put all your eggs into the psychedelic basket.
Mm-hmm.
Healing your ADHD and your addiction has to do with much broader issues than you're going to experience just in a psychedelic session. So psychedelics can be very helpful in having you come to terms with the trauma, but it has to be integrated. So don't just keep hoping that I'll keep taking these substances, they're going to change my brain. You deal with either condition, ADHD or addiction or both. Work on the trauma. Use the psychedelics to help heal the trauma. Notice your brain's or your mind's propensity to escape from the present moment. Use the substances to learn how to be with the present moment. Notice the pain that's inside you. Learn how to hold that pain without having to run away from it, which is what both ADHD and addictions are all about. So you can use the psychedelics, but as part of a much broader integrated approach that has to involve, I think, counseling, how you treat your body in terms of nutrition and exercise and nature. And psychedelics can be a very potent part of that mix. But don't look to them as the elixir of healing.
Hmm. Well, I think one of the reasons people like you so much and you're so approachable is you're so open with your own journey and your own story and how, you know, life is not always rosy for Gabor Mate. Could you maybe speak on uh, what's working for you right now as far as do you have a daily practice underway right now? I think you do. What do you do to kind of integrate the spiritual, as it were, into your daily life or bring yourself more into that present moment?
Well, as I said in one of my books, I have a profound relationship with meditation. I think about it every day. The last time we spoke, about a week ago, I did have a daily practice. That was a week ago. Don't ask me today, because more recently I've been really caught up in writing my book and doing all these online talks and but I do look after myself, and
Mhm.
so yes, I have an off and on practice of yoga and meditation. What I never miss is physical exercise. I mean, I'd rather exercise than meditate, to tell you the truth. If it comes down to a choice and time crunch,
You're
that
swimming still?
I'm swimming 3 times a week, and
Yeah.
every day I do something,
Mhm.
and my biggest area of spiritual work actually is my relationship with my spouse,
Mm.
because you have to keep growing and you have to keep opening up and staying vulnerable. So when I do that, for me, it's much more effective than when I sit on the meditation cushion. So, having said that, for a lot of people, yoga and meditation are absolutely essential. Um, so yeah, there's a whole number of ways, and the way that I really need to take care of myself is not to accept every invitation that comes my way, and not to
Mhm.
identify with this role of the whatever role the world sees me, and not to identify with it, because it's not nobody's their role, and there's a real tendency for all of us to identify with our roles. So that's my biggest spiritual work, so no formal practice, yes, but I'm hardly the one to preach formal practice to people when I'm such a intermittent practitioner.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, see,
I have a friend who wakes up at 5. I have two friends who wake up at 5 in the morning. One of them does yoga for 2 hours, the other meditates for 2 hours every day.
wow.
For me to even in 5 minutes a day is like a stretch, So I think it takes all kinds.
Yeah. Another good question here. This is from Dr. Erica Zelfland, happens to be a friend and colleague of mine. There seems to have been much vilification of conventional antidepressant medications and mood stabilizers, etc., within the psychedelic world. Can you speak to the place of pharmaceutical medications in the treatment of trauma and mental health ailments?
Yeah. Um, Let me begin by saying that I've taken antidepressants myself, and they've helped me. I mean, the first time I took antidepressants, I was in my 40s, and within 3 days, I said to my sister-in-law, "You mean people can feel like this normally?" Because there was a book in the 60s or the 70s entitled um, "I've been down so long it feels like up to me," and I just assumed that my depressed state was the normal, natural way of being. I
Mm.
didn't know how depressed I'd been until I wasn't depressed anymore as a result of taking antidepressants. So yes, they can be of help, but the medical use of antidepressants is used in based on a completely false assumption, which is that depression is a disease of the brain, biologically rooted disease of the brain. You know how much evidence for that? Zero. And you know how much evidence there's for this belief that a lack of serotonin causes depression? Zero. You know how much evidence there's for the belief that any mental health illness is caused by any particular gene or any group of genes? Zero. I've just reviewed all the science for this new book. I'm just telling you the scientific truth. So why did they work? They do sometimes work. They've helped me. Well, here's the thing. It's like if you had a migraine headache and you took an aspirin and it worked, would that prove that the migraine was caused by a lack of aspirin? If you felt socially shy and you had a drink, would it be, can you argue that the reason that social anxiety is a biological disease caused by a lack of alcohol? So I wish you actually, the truth is we don't know how these medications work or why they work. But the fact is sometimes they do, and sometimes they're necessary. The problem is they're way overprescribed. People take them for far too long, and most physicians don't understand the traumatic basis of depression or other mental health conditions. So that these medications, unlike the psychedelics, which allow people to get at root causes, the antidepressants don't do that. They deal with symptoms. So that could be a very helpful thing for people sometime, as they have been for me at times. By the way, more recently when I've tried them, all I get is side effects and no benefit. That means my brain has changed. Thank God, you know. So the brain is capacity to learn and to change. So I'll never go to them again, you know. But having said that, they have their place. My problem is not that they're used, but usually that's the go-to and the only treatment people receive.
Mhm.
So I think for certain people, for certain periods of time, they can be helpful and in some cases life-saving, but we rely on them far too much, ignoring the real reason why people are depressed or why they're suffering mental distress.
Right. Another question here. Can you speak to the concept of resiliency and how two people can grow up in the same environment, suffer the same traumas, and one continues to suffer and engage in problem behaviors while the other seems to thrive and recover? Any ideas there?
Well, the very simple answer is no two people grow up in the same environment.
Mm,
Children in the same family have the same parents. No two children have the same family. No two children have the same experiences growing up. They just don't. A whole lot of reasons for that. One is the parents are different with each child. I don't mean that the rules are different or that they love one more than the other. It's that each child evokes a different aspect of the parent. I can tell you that as a parent. So each child experiences a different parent, number one. Number two, children are born in different ages. The experience of a firstborn is not the same as the experience of a secondborn. Number three, the parents' relationship with one another might not exactly be the same when one child is born than when another child is born. Number
mm,
four, each child is born with their own temperament. So D.W. Winnicott, great British psychiatrist, said, child psychiatrist, he said that even if a mother could be the same mother to all 8 of her children, which she couldn't be, but even if she could be, they'd all have 8 different mothers because all of them have different temperaments. So they experience them differently. So no, you can never say that people experience the same trauma or the same environment. That's never the case. Having said that, what makes the difference in resilience is how much support you get. So what if two children have the same experiences, which they can't? Or even if they did the one of them have one person in their life who at some point validated their experience and mirrored some positive sense of themselves? That see, trauma is not what happens to you; it's what happens inside you. And what happens inside you is very much conditioned by what kind of mirroring or holding you receive at some point or another. So nobody has exactly the same experiences, and even if they could, they couldn't. But even if they did, it depends very much on what kind of environment shapes them, and did they have even one person who was in any way a mitigating factor. Resilience is not an individual quality; it's a social quality.
mm. Beautiful, thank you. Um, And we're coming to the top of the hour. And thank you for having spent this hour with us. As I said at the start, your generosity with organizations like MAPS Canada, organizations like the Canadian Psychedelic Association now, it's just, you're a pretty big deal, G. So to show up and support these community initiatives, it really goes a long way. So I'm so, so grateful for this hour with you.
Can I tell my wife you said that?
Yeah, you can. But I love this question. Which comes first, societal change or individual mental health and enlightenment? Or do they go back and forth between the two?
Well, look, I've been a lifelong activist politically and an advocate for change. And there's been some changes, and not all for the better, and some for the better. But if I waited for societal change, um, I would never have touched individual work, because if the individual work depended on societal change, there's a Hungarian expression that by the time that happens, I'll be smelling the flowers from below. So it's not one or the other, and I don't set up that dichotomy. It so happens that as people transform and as they grow in themselves, the more generous they want to be and the more supportive they want to be of other people's transformation, and the more compassionate they become, and the more interested they are in cultural or social or political transformation. And that's good. So it's not one or the other. It's the two go hand in hand. But obviously, on the individual level, it's easier to get there than it is on a broad social level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And maybe just you've got everybody's rapt attention right now. Thank you so much again for spending this hour with us. And if you could leave everybody maybe with some words of inspiration on the way out here. I know life isn't all that inspiring sometime, and psychedelics are not a magic bullet and they aren't the panacea, but based on some of the transformations that you have seen, could you leave us with a little bit of hope maybe?
Well, first of all, I don't deal in hope, because hope is this wish that something will happen in the future, totally gets us away from the present moment. So it's not a question of hope, it's a question of possibility, of what's possible. And I've seen what's possible. I've seen the potential that psychedelics have. A lot of people listening or watching this podcast have had the same experience. A lot of great professionals have done superb work on it. This is a conversation that 10 years ago would not have attracted 700 people, so that itself is a sign of change. So never mind hope. There's all this possibility here. And it's a question of to what degree are we willing and committed to grasping and embracing those possibilities. I can't inspire anybody else. That has to come from within. That really has to come from within. But if you're on this podcast, you're already inspired. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be here. So I don't need to tell you. One thing I want to tell everybody about, this is totally self-serving.
Yes, please.
It's not totally self-serving, but it is self-promoting in a way. There's a documentary film about my work, including psychedelic work, called The Wisdom of Trauma, which is going to be launched in mid-June. And that week when it's launched, I'll be in conversation every day with people like Peter Levine, a very famous trauma pioneer, Esther Perel on trauma and sexuality, Stephen Porges, great psychologist, does the work on the nervous system and safety. Rishma McCammon on racism and so on. there'll be a day I'm going to spend with Francois Borzat, not a day, but an hour,
Nice.
and other Rick Doblin and others
Nice.
talking about psychedelics. So that documentary is called The Wisdom of Trauma, and you can look for it. You can sign up for the launch and take in all those talks that week. So I'm excited to tell people about that, and it will have a strong psychedelic dimension to it.
Wonderful. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for joining us, everybody. This was brought to you by the Canadian Psychedelic Association. We're a relatively newly formed nonprofit that we've used a couple of metaphors throughout the creation of this. Number one, we want to be a beacon so people who are interested in psychedelics across Canada and beyond can find other people who are like-minded. Then we want to be the tent where everybody can come together and talk about the different nuances of these substances. So and we don't have to all get along in the tent. There's a lot to be discussed and figured out as we move forward and do our best to turn these into the potential that they are. But if we are currently working towards a big parliamentary push towards having psychedelics, therapeutic psychedelics, as a part of the conversation in the medical assistance in dying legislation that's up for review right now. So becoming a member allows you access to webinars like this, helps you support webinars like this, helps you support things like our parliamentary review and getting the psychedelic conversation in front of the government. So please consider joining the Canadian Psychedelic Association. It's inexpensive, you get a lot for it, and we've got a great membership community that is off of Facebook. We've got our own platform for that. So if you want to go to joincpa.ca, there's actually a promotion on right now as well to incentivize that. There's a trip to Costa Rica you could win, some crazy stuff. So if you do that by Friday, you can do that. So Gabor, I'm honored to call you a friend. I look forward to connecting in person again when we can next time. And I'm just so grateful that you spent some time to talk psychedelics with our friends here online. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trevor, and thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks. Goodbye, everyone.